What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? Frank Dalton sat alone at his kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound keeping him company as dusk settled over the small Indiana town he'd called home for more than 40 years. The TV flickered in the next room, tuned to a news channel he no longer had the heart to follow. A stack of unpaid bills sat beneath his calloused hands. His left knee throbbed. The walker his doctor insisted on sat and used by the front door like an accusation. His daughter, Julie, had suggested he look at the senior living center on the edge of town, nicely furnished, she'd said, and no more stairs. That suggestion had sat in the air like smoke he couldn't wave away. He hadn't said no. He just hadn't said anything at all. He couldn't remember the last time someone asked what he wanted. At 68, his days all looked the same. Cereal in the morning, 2 hours watching reruns, a slow walk around the block if his back behaved, maybe fixing something small if his fingers didn't betray him. Nights were the worst. Silence thick as syrup. June had passed 5 years ago, her laugh still echoing somewhere in the house if he closed his eyes hard enough. Since then, he'd been disappearing in pieces, one unnoticed part at a time. Friends stopped calling. His tools sat rusting in the garage. His son, Eddie, hadn't returned a call in 3 years. Too old, he muttered, barely hearing his own voice over the ticking of the old wall clock. He picked up the remote and flipped through YouTube clips on his tablet, looking for nothing. A cat playing piano. A sports blooper. A political rant. Then something strange caught his eye. A title, Why You're Not Too Old to Build a Rocket. The thumbnail showed Elon Musk standing in front of a SpaceX launch pad. Frank almost skipped it. What could a billionaire in California say to a washed-up widower in Indiana? But something in the headline echoed in him. He clicked. Musk's voice filled the kitchen. People ask when it's too late. I think the better question is, why did you ever believe it was? Frank leaned closer. Musk was pacing on a stage, wearing that slightly rumpled jacket, eyes lit up. Some people retire at 50. Others build companies at 70. It's never really about age. It's about curiosity. Risk. Staying alive up here. He tapped his temple. Frank's hand trembled slightly on the edge of the table. He watched the whole clip. Then watched it again. And a third time. Something stirred that he hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly. More like defiance. A quiet rebellion against the idea that he was done. The video ended, and he sat there, blinking in the dim light, the tablet screen going dark. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, the host had said in the outro. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank found his fingers moving before he even thought it through. He opened the comment box. Typed slowly, watching from Indiana. Used to build things. Thinking maybe I still can. He stared at the words. Hovered his finger over the post button. And tapped. The message disappeared into the sea of comments, but he felt something click inside, like a door creaking open. He sat back and looked at the wall above the table. There was a photo of him and June in front of the Grand Canyon, her eyes squinting in the sun, her arm around his waist. That trip had been her idea. She used to say, it's not about how many years you get, it's what you do with them. He hadn't done much since she'd gone. Not really. The garage had become a storage pit. His sketchbooks, filled with ideas, inventions, little mechanical dreams, were packed in boxes under the stairs. He couldn't remember the last time he held a wrench with a purpose. But Elon Musk was right about one thing. The question wasn't about age. It was about believing. Believing something could still begin, even now. Especially now. He stood slowly, knee protesting, and walked to the hallway. He reached behind the coats, past the unopened vacuum box Julie had brought him last Christmas, and pulled out an old plastic tub. Inside were the sketchbooks, faded, coffee-stained, full of notes. Diagrams for an automatic door closer. A design for a self-watering plant system. Even a battery-powered garden cart he'd once dreamed of building for June when her arthritis got bad. He sat cross-legged on the floor like he hadn't in years, the walker forgotten behind him. He flipped through the pages, each one a time capsule from the man he used to be. It felt like touching a ghost. But this ghost wasn't haunting him. It was reminding him. He could hear June's voice in his head, teasing him, "Go on, fix something. You always feel better after." He looked at his hands, older, yes. Slower, maybe. But still steady. Still capable. Still his. He found the garden cart page and stared at it for a long time. It was simple, really, nothing fancy. A flat platform with wheels, a light frame, powered by rechargeable batteries. He had some of the parts in the garage. Probably enough to make a prototype. The thought made his heart beat a little faster. Not just with excitement. With fear, too. He hadn't built anything in years. What if he couldn't finish it? What if he got hurt again? What if people laughed? But then he remembered what Musk had said. Limits are usually lies we tell ourselves to feel safe. Maybe Frank had been lying to himself for too long. Maybe safety had become his prison. He stood up, bones groaning in protest, and made his way to the garage. The air smelled like rust and old oil. Cobwebs hung from the shelves. His workbench sat in the corner, half covered in dusty tools and unopened mail. He flipped the light switch. The fluorescent bulb flickered to life with a faint hum. He ran his hand along the bench, clearing a space. Picked up a screwdriver. Familiar weight. Muscle memory kicked in. He plugged in the battery charger. Pulled a box of old wires from the shelf. It wasn't much. But it was a beginning. The garage didn't look like much to anyone else. But to Frank, standing there in the glow of that flickering bulb, it looked like a launch pad. Not for a rocket. For something even bigger. A second chance. He took a deep breath. Turned on the radio, classic rock, just like he used to. And started to work. The morning sun filtered through the half-closed blinds, casting soft stripes across the kitchen floor. Frank Dalton sat at the table, cradling a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He wasn't really tasting it. He was still thinking about last night, about that video, about Musk's voice echoing in his head. Something had shifted. He didn't know what to call it. It wasn't exactly joy. But it wasn't despair either. It was movement. A pulse of energy that hadn't been there in a long, long time. He got up slowly, joints stiff, and shuffled toward the hallway. The plastic tub of old sketchbooks still sat where he'd left it. He knelt down, carefully this time, and opened the top. He pulled out the notebook with the blue duct tape on the spine. That was his favorite one. The one he'd carried around back when ideas would hit him at the gas station or in the grocery store line or on the back porch watching June tend the garden. Back then, he believed ideas had weight. That they could turn into real things if he just stayed curious. He flipped through the pages. Hand-drawn diagrams, measurements, equations, scribbled notes in the margins. Most of them seemed silly now, but a few still sparked something real. The battery-powered garden cart stood out. He remembered sketching it the year before June's knees finally gave out. She'd been so proud, still tending her tomatoes and basil, even when it hurt to bend down. He was going to build that cart to make it easier for her, to let her keep doing what she loved. But then work got busy. And then she got worse. And then the chemo started. And then she was gone. He slammed the notebook shut and stared at the ceiling. It hurt to think about her, even now. Maybe especially now. Not in the crying way. In the quiet way. Like the world had lost color when she left, and he'd been pretending he didn't notice. He stood, took the notebook with him, and made his way to the back door. The garage was waiting. He opened it slowly, the hinges squealing in protest. The light from outside spilled in, illuminating the dust particles that danced in the air. He reached for the switch, and the overhead bulb flickered to life. Everything was just where he'd left it 5 years ago. The vice grip, the soldering iron, the pegboard full of screwdrivers and wrenches. Some of the tools were rusty. Others looked untouched. All of it felt like home. He cleared off a spot on the workbench and laid the notebook open to the garden cart plans. He began sorting through parts, organizing bolts, wheels, and battery cells. As his hands moved, something came back to him, not just memory, but identity. For most of his life, he'd worked in auto shops and later on the factory floor, diagnosing electrical issues, fixing things no one else could. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. And he was damn good at it. People used to say, if Frank can't fix it, toss it. He remembered once when his son Eddie was 10, he'd brought home a broken RC car and begged Frank to fix it. They worked on it all weekend, side by side. Frank taught him how to solder for the first time. They got it working by Sunday afternoon and raced it down the sidewalk until the battery died. That night, Eddie told his mom that Dad was the smartest man in the world. That memory hit him like a wave. Eddie. The ache of that name lived somewhere deep in his ribs. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the funeral, not really. There'd been a fight. About the will. About money. About something else, too, pride, maybe. Hurt. Eddie had walked out. Never returned the calls. Never came back. Frank still replayed the words sometimes, the ones he never should have said. If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back. He hadn't meant it. He just didn't know how to hurt less. Now, there was silence. Just the buzz of the garage light and the creak of old wood beneath his boots. He pushed the thought aside and got back to work. A couple hours passed. He managed to get the basic frame assembled from an old dolly and some scrap metal. It was crude but promising. He felt it again, that small flicker. Like the world wasn't finished with him yet. Like he could still make something that mattered. He took a break and wiped sweat from his brow with a rag that smelled faintly of motor oil. As he sipped a glass of water on the back porch, he saw his neighbor's teenage grandson, Kyle, riding a motorized scooter across the street. The thing sputtered and stalled halfway up the driveway. The kid kicked it and cursed. Frank couldn't help himself. "You checked the fuse line," he called out. Kyle looked over, surprised. "I dunno," he shrugged. "Probably just junk." "Bring it over," Frank said without thinking. "I'll take a look." 10 minutes later, the scooter was in his garage. Frank popped the panel, found the burned-out wire, replaced it with a spare, and had the thing running again in 20 minutes. Kyle's eyes lit up. "No way. You fixed it." "Just needed some patience," Frank said. "And decent wiring." The kid grinned and gave a half-hearted, "Thanks, Mr. Dalton," before scooting off. But the moment lingered. It had felt good to help. To matter. He couldn't remember the last time someone asked him for help, let alone listened. Back in the kitchen that night, he sat with his dinner, a microwaved Salisbury steak that tasted mostly like cardboard, and stared at the blinking cursor on his tablet. He opened YouTube again. The Elon Musk clip was still in his history. He rewatched it, letting the words wash over him. "It's not about being fearless," Musk said in the clip. "It's about acting despite the fear. If you wait until everything feels safe, you'll wait forever." Frank closed the app and opened his notes. He started a new entry. He typed slowly, his fingers stiff but steady. Goal: Build a working prototype of the garden cart. Use only what's on hand. 1 hour per day in the garage. No excuses. Just momentum. He paused, then added one more line, try again. Try for real this time. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled. He didn't know what would come of it. Maybe nothing. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like his days were just waiting for something to end. He felt like something was beginning. The next morning, he put on his work boots instead of slippers. Opened the blinds. Turned on the radio. The garage was waiting, and so was he. And this time, he wasn't just remembering the man he used to be. He was becoming him again. It was 3 days since Frank Dalton stepped back into the garage, and already, that familiar ache had returned. Low in his back, deep in his knees, like his body was reminding him of every year he wasn't 25 anymore. He stood at the workbench anyway, holding a stripped bolt between his fingers, eyes narrowing at the crooked fit. He grunted under his breath, laid the bolt down, and stretched out his shoulders. The rusted hinges on his joints creaked with the motion. He looked at the half-built cart frame in front of him and sighed. The battery compartment wouldn't hold. The casters weren't locking right. And the wheels, old lawnmower leftovers, had started to warp. A voice in his head whispered, "What are you even doing?" He tried to push it away, but it was stubborn, rooted deep. "You're 68. Your hands don't move like they used to. Your legs barely hold you upright for more than an hour at a time. Who are you kidding? It's a waste of time." It was almost comforting, that voice. Familiar. The kind that says, "Be realistic," but means, "Stop dreaming." He'd heard it before, not from strangers, but from people who claimed to care. People like his brother David, who'd once said, "Frank, some people are meant to build, and some are meant to let it go." Or the HR manager at the plant who suggested retirement early after Frank's second back surgery. Even Julie, his daughter, bless her heart, had started looking at him like he was something fragile, porcelain. He hated that look. He hated it more than the creaking knees and missed phone calls and bitter coffee. But today, he'd heard it again, plain as day, in the voice of his own doctor. Dr. Patel was kind, well-meaning, but too quick with her warnings. "You need to be careful, Frank. You've had 2 falls in the past year. Your bones aren't what they were. Might be time to scale things back. Let others take the lead. Scale things back. Let others." Frank nodded politely at the time, thanked her, walked out with a paper in his hand about physical therapy options, and never called the number. But the words clung to him. Scaled him back inside his own mind. That afternoon, he sat in his recliner, a heating pad behind his lower back, the notebook open on his lap but untouched. The TV buzzed with some courtroom show he wasn't watching. He flipped idly through the notebook, no real aim, just drifting between half-finished ideas and smudged pencil marks. Then the power went out. Everything went dark with a low thump, like the house exhaling. The AC stopped. The lights flicked dead. Even the refrigerator gave a reluctant click. Frank blinked into the silence. He reached for the flashlight in the drawer. Clicked it on. Its beam passed over the notebook, then stopped on the tablet on the side table. It was still charged. He tapped it on and opened the YouTube app, not sure what he was looking for. Maybe some background noise. Maybe just a voice that didn't sound tired. He typed in Elon Musk mindset. The first video was short, under 4 minutes. Titled, "It's Not Too Late Unless You Think It Is." He tapped play. Musk stood on stage, younger than Frank expected in the clip, maybe late 30s, speaking at some college event. "You know," Musk said, pacing slowly, "most of the people who do extraordinary things never felt extraordinary. They just felt curious. And tired of excuses." The students laughed lightly, but Musk didn't. "Your brain wants you to stay comfortable. Safe. That's how it's wired. But comfort is overrated. It's also the graveyard of most people's potential. Frank stared at the screen. Musk kept going. I don't care if you're 15 or 55 or 70. If you have a question burning inside you, try to answer it. If you have something you want to build, start. And if you think you're too old to matter, remember this, the clock only wins if you give it permission. Frank watched the video twice. Maybe 3 times. Then he sat very still. The flashlight beam started to flicker. He clicked it off and sat in the dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the tablet screen. The question settled in his chest like a stone, was it really too late? Or had he just given the clock permission? The next morning, power restored and coffee hot, he stood at the sink rinsing dishes when a knock came at the door. Julie. She stepped in with a smile, grocery bags in her arms. Brought you a few things. Milk, your favorite crackers. And, she paused, eyes darting past him toward the open door to the garage, are you still messing around out there? Frank turned off the faucet and dried his hands slowly. I am, he said simply. Julie gave a small sigh, the kind that wasn't loud but full of meaning. Dad, I know you miss keeping busy, but I worry. You fell last time you tried to change a light bulb. He looked at her. She wasn't being cruel. She was scared. That made it worse. It's not about keeping busy, he said. It's about remembering I can still do things. She looked at him for a long second. Why now? She asked. Why this? He thought about it. Thought about the silence in the house. The ache of being needed by no one. The spark from Musk's words. Because I finally remembered who I was, he said. And I'm not ready to fade out quietly. Julie softened, but not entirely. Just be careful, Dad. Please. He nodded. She left 20 minutes later, leaving behind groceries and concern. That afternoon, he limped to the garage. He looked at the frame. Still clunky. Still uneven. He reached for the socket wrench and got to work. He watched more Elon videos that week. Interviews, keynotes, podcasts. Not because he idolized the man, but because there was something about the way he talked. Defiant. Unapologetic. Creative in a way that didn't ask permission. One night he came across a podcast where Musk was asked what advice he'd give his younger self. Musk answered, I wouldn't bother. My younger self wouldn't listen. But I'd probably say, don't waste time doubting what you already know you love. Frank paused the clip. That one hit hard. What do you already love? He asked himself. The answer came quickly, building. Fixing. Solving. Making something that works. That weekend, he walked down to the local hardware store, slowly, cane in hand, and bought a few parts. He stood in front of the shelves for nearly 20 minutes debating wire gauges and motor sizes. A younger clerk eventually walked over and said, Need help, sir? Frank almost said no. Then changed his mind. Actually, he said, pointing to a part, do you have this in a 24-volt spec? The clerk blinked, surprised, then nodded. Yeah, hang on. You working on something electric? Trying to, Frank said. Battery-powered garden cart. The clerk raised his eyebrows. Seriously? Frank smiled. Dead serious. He returned home, toolbox in hand, ideas in motion. That night, in the kitchen, he jotted down his first real schedule in years, mornings, coffee and YouTube for inspiration. Afternoons, 1 hour of building. Nights, review progress, write notes. No 0 days. That was a term he'd heard in a Musk interview. Even if all you do is tighten a bolt or write down an idea, Musk had said, you're not standing still. No 0 days. Frank posted it on the garage wall in big block letters. He looked at it every time he walked in. The cart was still rough, still full of problems. But something inside him had turned. The question wasn't why try anymore. It was how far can I go before the clock catches me? He didn't know the answer. But for the first time in a very long time, he wanted to find out. The socket wrench slipped from Frank's hand, clattering to the garage floor with a sharp metallic rattle. He winced, not just from the sound, but from the jolt in his wrist. "Damn fingers," he muttered, flexing them slowly. They didn't move like they used to. The knuckles were swollen, stiff from decades of torquing bolts, pulling wires, and gripping too tight for too long. He knelt down carefully, bones creaking like old floorboards, and retrieved the wrench. Then he sat back on the stool and stared at the half-finished frame of the garden cart. It wasn't pretty, yet. But it was real. A month ago, it had been just a sketch in a dusty notebook. Now it had shape. Steel. Bolts. Wires. A motor that buzzed when coaxed. That morning, he'd attached the axle brackets. Just 2 bolts each. Took him 45 minutes. His younger self would have done it in 10. But he finished. And something about finishing, even something small, made his chest feel like it could carry more air. He looked up at the "No 0 days" sign he'd taped above the bench. The letters were thick, shaky, written with a fat black Sharpie. It looked ridiculous. It also worked. Because every time he wanted to quit, because his back hurt or his hands were stubborn or the world felt like it wasn't watching, it reminded him that the point wasn't speed. It was momentum. A tiny knock interrupted his thoughts. He turned his head and saw Kyle, the teenage neighbor with the scooter, standing just outside the garage, holding a bag of chips and a bottle of root beer. "Hey, Mr. Dalton," he said. "You, fixing that cart still?" "Building it," Frank corrected. "Not fixing. It didn't exist until now." Kyle stepped inside slowly, looking around at the tools, the scattered wires, the cart in progress. "Looks complicated." "It is," Frank said, standing and wiping his hands on a rag. "That's why it matters." Kyle looked unconvinced. "What's it for? Like a robot or something?" Frank smiled. "A garden cart. Powered. For people who want to keep working outside even if their legs are shot." Kyle squinted. "That's kinda cool." Frank handed him a pair of safety goggles. "Want to help?" Kyle blinked. "Me? You ever stripped a wire?" "No, you're about to." They worked in silence for a while. Frank guided Kyle's hands as he showed him how to peel insulation, twist copper ends, measure voltage without frying the multimeter. The kid wasn't a natural, but he was quick to listen. More than that, he watched, the way someone who's actually curious watches. "This is wild," Kyle said after 20 minutes. "My grandpa doesn't even know how to use the microwave." "Microwaves are overrated," Frank said without looking up. "They ruin coffee." Kyle laughed. "My mom says you were an electrician or something. Mechanic. And before that, factory floor. Started wiring radio kits in high school. Thought I'd be an inventor once." "What happened?" Frank paused. That was the question, wasn't it? What did happen? Life. Jobs. Bills. Kids. Losing June. Losing time. "I forgot," he said finally. "Forgot what I loved." Kyle didn't say anything. Just kept threading the wires, slower now. Frank watched him for a minute, then returned to the bench. He tightened one of the frame bolts and something clicked. Literally and emotionally. It was the first bolt he'd secured that week without a wobble. It held. He grinned. That night, Frank sat at the kitchen table, writing notes in the margin of his sketchbook. The build was slow, yes, but it was happening. Kyle had helped mount the support arm. They'd tested the wheel spin. The wiring was still a mess, but progress was progress. Frank glanced at the wall clock. Nearly midnight. He reached for the tablet and opened YouTube. He didn't even have to type anymore, the algorithm knew him. The top video was another Elon Musk interview, this one titled, "Why Starting Late Can Be an Advantage." He tapped play. Musk sat in a chair across from a young interviewer, both silhouetted against a blue-lit stage. "People assume that youth equals innovation," Musk said, "but I think there's a massive advantage in experience. The trick is not letting experience turn into limitation. Older people know what doesn't work. That's power, if you're willing to re-engage." Frank leaned forward slightly. That word, re-engage, stuck. That was exactly what he'd been doing. Not becoming someone new. Just remembering someone old. Someone he used to be. After the video, Frank clicked open the comments section. Thousands of entries. Young people quoting Elon. Dreamers from India, students from Brazil, older viewers from rural America. He saw one comment from a woman named Marlene, 72, who said she just built her first website for retired teachers. Another from a man in Florida who'd started building wooden toys again after 30 years. Frank scrolled, thumb hovering. Then, on impulse, he typed, "Still building at 68. Started a powered garden cart this month. Took me an hour to drill 2 holes today. Felt like a rocket launch. Keep going, whoever you are." He hit post. And for a brief second, he felt the strangest thing, connection. Not to a screen. Not to Elon. But to the spirit of what those people were doing. Trying. Learning. Refusing to vanish. The next day, Frank returned to the garage early. His body protested, but his mind was sharp. He managed to wire the basic motor switch. It sparked once, but didn't burn out. Kyle showed up after school and helped mount the front bracket. They high-fived like teammates. On the porch later, Frank told Kyle about June. About the tomatoes. About why the cart mattered. Kyle didn't laugh or squirm. Just listened. "You really miss her, huh?" he asked quietly. "Every day," Frank said. "But building this. I think it brings her back a little." That night, Frank couldn't sleep. Not from worry, but from ideas. Real ones. He made a list of potential upgrades: adjustable handles, lightweight wheels, solar charging. He hadn't made a list like that since he was in his 30s. Maybe he'd never stopped being an inventor. Maybe he'd just stopped giving himself permission. Elon had said once, "Build something small and stupid. Just build. The rest figures itself out." Frank looked at his cart the next morning and smiled. Small? Yes. Stupid? Maybe. But it was his. And it was moving forward. Bolt by bolt. Hour by hour. No 0 days. Frank woke before the sun, the early gray light stretching thin across the bedroom wall, a pale reminder that another day had arrived whether he wanted it to or not. His right shoulder ached from yesterday's work, a deep, dull throb that made him feel every day of 68. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited for his body to catch up with his will. 5 minutes passed. Maybe 10. Then he stood. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't easy. But it was happening. He shuffled toward the kitchen, filled the kettle, and stared out the window as it began to whistle. The yard was overgrown. Weeds poked through the cracks in the driveway. The bird feeder June used to refill every Saturday hung empty, swaying gently in the breeze. He hadn't touched it since the week she died. Maybe this weekend, he thought. One thing at a time. He poured his coffee and sat at the kitchen table, flipping open the black notebook with the blue tape on the spine. Yesterday's notes were scribbled in the corner, motor mount resecured. Test switch failed. Kyle suggests 12V parallel, investigate. He smiled. The kid was paying attention. Frank had looked up the wiring diagram late last night, blinking into the glow of his tablet, and realized Kyle might be right. It made him oddly proud, and a little envious. At 17, Kyle had more raw access to tools, tutorials, online communities than Frank ever did at 30. But the kid still needed guidance. And Frank still had that. He pushed himself up, slowly, and headed to the garage. The air was cool, the tools exactly where he'd left them. He flicked on the light and the hum of fluorescent bulbs buzzed into life. The frame of the garden cart sat there, waiting, like a dog eager to go for a walk. He picked up the multimeter and began testing the circuit again. Click. Spark. Dead. He double-checked the connection. Then he saw it, the wire he'd twisted yesterday had slipped just enough to break contact. He re-stripped it, tightened it, and soldered the joint. This time when he flipped the switch, the motor gave a steady, clean hum. "There you are," he whispered. He wasn't used to talking aloud, but it felt right. The machine had a heartbeat now. That afternoon, Kyle dropped by again, phone in hand, half a bag of pretzels stuffed in his jacket. "So I was watching this channel on battery upgrades," he said, sliding into the garage without knocking. "This guy built a solar-powered pressure washer out of, like, junkyard stuff." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Pressure washer? What for?" "He just wanted to. Says he doesn't trust gas engines." Frank chuckled. "Sounds like my brother." Kyle grinned. Anyway, he posted his wiring diagram. "I saved it." Frank motioned to the bench. "Show me." For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side. Kyle traced lines. Frank tested resistors. They argued, they laughed, they disagreed over whether or not the cart should have a backup switch, and then Frank gave in. "All right," he muttered, "but if it sparks and burns my garage down, it's your fault." "Deal," Kyle said with a grin. When the power clicked on and the motor turned the wheels without stuttering, they both just stood there in silence, watching it roll forward across the concrete a whole 6 feet before Frank hit the kill switch. It was beautiful. It was ridiculous. It was working. That night, Frank sat back down at the table with a hot cup of tea. The ache in his shoulder was worse now. He hadn't taken anything for it all day. He could have. But the pain meant he'd done something that mattered. He sipped slowly, opened the tablet, and searched again. This time, he found a Musk quote he hadn't heard before, buried in the transcript of a 2008 interview: "Pain is not your enemy, it's a signal. The question isn't whether you feel it. The question is, does it stop you?" Frank put the tablet down and leaned back. His pain didn't stop him. Not anymore. It slowed him. Yes. But it didn't own him. Later that week, he got a phone call from an old friend he hadn't heard from in nearly a decade, Tom Booker, a former coworker from the factory days, now living in Fort Wayne. "Julie said you're building something," Tom said, his voice half curious, half amused. "Battery-powered garden cart," Frank replied. "For who?" "For me. For June. For anyone who needs it." Tom laughed. "You're serious." "Damn right I am." A pause on the other end. Then a quieter voice. "You know, I still have those lithium packs from our old tool racks. Could send you a few if you want." Frank felt something warm push against his ribs. Gratitude. Maybe even joy. "That'd be great, Tom. Thanks." After the call, he sat on the porch and stared at the sky. The stars had just begun to poke through the evening clouds. He used to do this with June every Friday, glass of wine in hand, her toes tucked beneath his on the porch swing. "You think we'll ever see someone walk on Mars?" she once asked him. He remembered replying, "I hope we do. But even if we don't, someone will. That's enough." She'd smiled at that. Always loved people who tried impossible things. He didn't know it then, but that memory would be the one that kept coming back to him, again and again, every time doubt crept in. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small folded slip of paper Kyle had given him earlier. It read, "Found this Elon quote online. Thought of you, failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." Frank folded it back up slowly. Failure was an option. So was pain. So was trying. And trying, he realized, was where he finally felt alive again. Not in the comfort. Not in the safety. In the reach. In the risk. That weekend, Frank brought the cart out to the driveway. Not done yet, still rough, still awkward, but functional. He maneuvered it over cracks in the concrete, checked the motor's strength going uphill. It could hold a small load now, 20, maybe 30 pounds. Enough for a few bags of soil. He hadn't touched the bird feeder in almost 5 years. That afternoon, he refilled it. He stood on the porch, cane in one hand, cart beside him, and hung it back on the hook. When the first chickadee landed an hour later, he smiled without even realizing. He wasn't fixed. He wasn't finished. But he was here. Building. Becoming. The pain hadn't left. But neither had he. It started with one photo. Just a quick snapshot Kyle had taken with his phone, a close-up of the garden cart in Frank's garage, surrounded by tools and scraps, sunlight filtering through the dust in the air. He didn't even ask for permission. He just took it, added a short caption, and posted it online. "My 68-year-old neighbor is building an electric cart from scratch because he says, being old doesn't mean being done." At first, nothing happened. Frank didn't even know about it. Kyle hadn't expected much, either. But by the next afternoon, the post had quietly spread, picked up by one of those accounts that collects inspiring stuff your grandpa might say, and then it caught fire. Tens of thousands of likes. A few thousand shares. Comments started pouring in. Some skeptical, sure, but most were awestruck. "Reminds me of my dad, he built his own canoe at 70. Wow. I needed this today. Feeling stuck in my 50s and this gave me hope. Proof that passion doesn't retire." Frank only found out when Julie showed up unannounced, phone in hand, her face lit with cautious excitement. "Dad," she said, stepping inside, "you're kind of famous." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Famous?" "Kyle posted a photo of your cart. It went viral. It's everywhere." She handed him the phone, and Frank scrolled slowly. His garage. His cart. His work. It was strange seeing it all filtered through someone else's screen, especially surrounded by bright little hearts and fire emojis and words like legend and badass. He handed the phone back. Why would people care? Julie smiled. Because you're doing something. Something real. Most people scroll through life. You're building. Frank didn't know what to say. He walked out to the garage like he had every morning for the last few weeks, but today it felt different. Not because the cart had changed, it hadn't, but because someone had noticed. For years, he'd felt invisible. At the grocery store. At the pharmacy. Even at church. Like he was fading out of the frame while the rest of the world kept speeding forward. But now, people were pointing back at him. Look, they were saying. Look at what he's doing. That night, Frank opened the tablet and typed his own post. It took him half an hour to find the right words. He wasn't good at short speeches, and he didn't like bragging. But eventually, he wrote, "I'm 68. I lost my wife. I lost track of myself. Then one day, I watched an Elon Musk video where he said, "The clock only wins if you give it permission." I decided to stop giving it permission. I started building something. It's not big. But it's mine. Don't let the world tell you when to quit. Keep your hands moving. You're not too old. You're just getting started. He posted it. Set the tablet down. And tried not to think about it. The next morning, the post had over 10,000 likes. Over 1,000 comments. People from all over, Idaho, Australia, New Jersey, Ireland. Seniors who'd given up and now were ordering supplies to finally start painting again. A former army mechanic in Alabama who said he hadn't touched a tool since 2003, but now wanted to start a YouTube channel for older tinkerers. And even a message from a woman named Christine in Nevada who wrote, "My husband passed away 3 years ago. I've been frozen in place ever since. Then I saw your story. Tomorrow I'm pulling my sewing machine out of the closet. Thank you." Frank sat quietly, overwhelmed, reading each one. He wasn't used to being seen. He wasn't used to being heard. And now, strangers were calling him brave. Inspirational. The word felt too big for him. He was just an old guy in a garage with sore knees and a stubborn heart. But still, it stirred something. Julie called again that night. "Dad, you've got interviews requesting to talk to you. Online blogs. Even a small news outlet." "I'm not really a talker," Frank replied. "You are now," she said. "You inspired people." He thought about that word. Inspired. It felt like something only other people did. Frank had always admired inventors, dreamers, rebels. But he never thought he could be one of them. Then he remembered another Elon Musk clip he'd seen weeks ago, where Elon said, "You don't need to be extraordinary to start. You just need to start." That afternoon, Frank wrote out a small checklist. 1. Tighten front wheel alignment. 2. Install brake lever. 3. Test torque on incline. 4. Respond to 3 messages. 5. Post update. He worked through the list methodically. Each item gave him a small burst of energy. That night, he posted a short video, shaky, filmed with Kyle's help, where he introduced himself and explained the cart. "This isn't about changing the world," he said to the camera. "It's about not letting the world change me." He paused, then added, "I thought I was done. Turns out, I just needed something to build. Even if it's just this little cart." The video blew up. 20,000 views. Then 50. Then 100. Comments from engineers, nurses, stay-at-home parents, retirees, even one teenager who said, "I showed this to my grandpa and he cried. He's digging out his fishing rods tomorrow." Frank blinked hard reading that one. Then he stepped outside and sat on the porch, letting the quiet wrap around him. He thought about June. About how she always believed people still had gifts in them, no matter how late in life. He wished she could see this. See him. Not just the cart, but the version of himself that had come back to life. Julie visited the next day and brought a framed print of the viral post. "Thought you should have it," she said, setting it on the mantel. Frank looked at it, shaking his head. "Feels weird." "Yeah," she said softly. "But good weird." He looked at her, the daughter he hadn't really seen in years, not like this. "You proud?" he asked, quieter than usual. She stepped forward and hugged him. "More than you know." That night, Frank stayed up late again, sketching new ideas for the cart, foldable handles, lighter frame materials, maybe even a small solar panel mount. He wasn't sure if he'd ever build those versions. But the ideas were there. He was there. No longer watching the clock. No longer waiting for someone to give him permission. He had picked up a wrench, turned a bolt, and found his voice again. Elon Musk was still just a man on a screen. But his message had cracked open something important. That the end isn't when the world goes quiet. The end is when you stop listening for the next thing to build. Frank wasn't ending. He was beginning. And now the world was watching. Frank stood by the cart, holding a screwdriver in one hand and a small motor casing in the other, when he heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up his driveway. Not the soft hum of Kyle's scooter or the delivery guy's quiet knock. This was heavier, deliberate. Tires crunching gravel like someone who didn't care if you knew they'd arrived. He looked up and squinted into the sunlight. It was his son. David. Suit jacket over one arm, Bluetooth earpiece still clipped to his collar, jaw tight. Frank set the motor casing down and wiped his hands on an old shop towel. Well, look who it is. David gave a short nod. Saw the videos. Figured I should stop by and see what the internet's fussing about. They're fussing about this, Frank replied, motioning to the electric cart. It's not done yet, but she moves. David walked toward it slowly, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He looked down at the frame, the wires, the rough welds, then back at Frank. You're putting all this effort into a glorified wheelbarrow. Frank let the comment hang there. He wasn't surprised. David always had a way of trimming wonder down to its bare, most cynical parts. It's more than a wheelbarrow, Frank said evenly. It's a reason to get out of bed. You could have joined a volunteer group. Or taken a class. Something useful. Frank exhaled through his nose. I tried sitting still, Dave. Didn't suit me. David looked around the garage. You've got people online cheering you on like you're building the next Tesla. They don't see the dust or the half-finished wiring. They see what they want to see. Frank felt the sting, but he didn't flinch. Maybe, he said. But for the first time in years, people do see me. That's more than I've had in a long time. David turned away and stared out into the yard, silence stretching between them. Finally, he said, Mom used to say you were the dreamer. That you always had 100 ideas and no time to finish any of them. Frank smiled gently. She was right. But she also knew I needed something to chase. When I stopped chasing, I started shrinking. David nodded slowly, his shoulders softening just slightly. You miss her. Every hour, Frank said. But she'd want me building. She always loved when I made things. Even when they broke. David was quiet again, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Saw this in the garage after the funeral. Figured I'd hold on to it till you were ready. He handed it to Frank. Inside was a photo, an old Polaroid from the 80s. Frank and June, standing beside a beat-up station wagon, a makeshift solar panel perched on the roof. She was laughing. He was pointing at something just out of frame, covered in grease. Frank swallowed. I forgot we tried this. That solar project. We thought we'd power the house with old calculator cells. You didn't even have a soldering iron. Just duct tape and wire hangers, David said, the ghost of a smile playing at his mouth. You looked ridiculous. But we were doing something. Frank tucked the photo into his pocket. That's all that ever mattered. David gave a long, reluctant sigh. All right, Dad. Show me how this thing works. Frank raised an eyebrow. You serious? I didn't drive 2 hours just to insult your hardware. Frank grinned, handed David the remote switch, and pointed toward the drive. The cart whirred to life and rolled forward with a satisfying hum. David laughed. That's actually smoother than I expected. She's got potential. So what's next? Frank leaned against the workbench. I finish version 1. Clean up the wiring. Post instructions online. Then maybe build a second one. Try different wheels. Lighter materials. David looked impressed. Sounds like a startup pitch. It's a legacy, Frank said. Not for money. For motion. For anyone like me who forgot they could still start something new. That evening, after David left, Frank sat on the porch with his tablet. A new video was trending, an old clip of Elon Musk walking through a Tesla factory, talking to engineers, giving feedback. But it wasn't the factory that caught Frank's attention. It was Elon's expression. Focused. Tired. Determined. Someone in the comments had captioned it, "Great things are built in places that don't look great at first." Frank chuckled. Ain't that the truth? He scrolled through more comments, one from a retired Navy man who'd started writing again. One from a woman in her 60s who'd begun building birdhouses and selling them online. Another from a high school teacher newly retired who said she finally took the plunge and bought a keyboard to compose music. It wasn't the cart that was inspiring people. It was the decision. The movement. Frank added another note to his notebook, not just a product. A permission slip. Give people one reason to try. The next morning, Kyle arrived with two more teens in tow, one named Leo who brought a 3D printer part, and one named Maddie who had soldering skills. Frank looked at them, surprised. This turning into shop class now? Kinda, Kyle shrugged. They saw the post. Thought it was cool. Asked if they could help. Frank nodded slowly. All right then. Let's get to work. They huddled in the garage, tools clicking, wires twisting, parts being adjusted. The garage, once silent and forgotten, was now full of voices. Energy. Possibility. Later that day, Frank sat back and watched them. These kids didn't see an old man. They saw a builder. A guide. A teammate. And for the first time in years, Frank didn't feel like a relic. He felt useful. He thought back to the question that haunted him in the early days, does anyone care? Now he knew the answer. They did. And more importantly, he did. He hadn't been building just a cart. He'd been building a bridge. Between generations. Between grief and healing. Between fading and beginning again. One bolt at a time. It happened on a Monday. Not dramatic, not noisy, just a quiet failure that almost unraveled the whole thing. Frank had been testing the updated drive system with the teenagers when the cart suddenly lurched sideways, sparks spitting from beneath the frame. The front wheel mount snapped. The motor whined. Then everything went dark. Kyle jumped back. Maddie let out a sharp gasp. Kill the power. Frank barked, his voice more forceful than he'd meant. Kyle hit the switch. Silence. The cart leaned to one side like a wounded animal. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Maddie stepped forward. Did we blow the controller? Frank was still staring at the wheel. No, he muttered. We overloaded the frame. The angle was too sharp. I should have braced it better. The kids looked to him like they'd just crashed a spaceship. Frank stood slowly. It's okay, he said. We'll fix it. But inside, something cracked. That night, after they'd all gone home, Frank sat in the dark garage, alone. The light over his workbench flickered as if on cue. His back ached. His fingers throbbed. The scent of burnt solder hung in the air like a warning. The busted cart stared at him, its frame bent, its wires tangled. He slumped into the old stool and just sat there, staring. A whisper crawled back into his mind, the one that always waited for an opening. What are you doing? You're not an engineer. You're not young. You're not fast. You can't even fix this without help. Maybe they were right. Maybe it's time to sit down. Be quiet. Let it go. He lowered his head. For a moment, he believed it. For a moment, the noise was louder than the progress. Then he noticed something. Sitting right where the kids had left it, under a roll of tape, was a hand-drawn diagram. It wasn't his. It was Maddie's. A sketch of an alternative brace system for the front wheel, scribbled in pencil with little arrows and notes. Try a dual joint support here. Stronger under torque. He picked it up. Smiled. She'd already seen the flaw. Already thought through a solution. And more importantly, she'd assumed they'd keep going. She never wrote if. Only when. That subtle choice of words landed like a spark in his chest. Maybe he didn't have to rebuild it alone. Maybe it was okay to hit a wall, as long as you knew there was a window nearby. He stood up, grabbed the whiteboard from the back wall, and began mapping out a new plan. Reinforced bracket. Shock support. Lighter motor. It was 2 a.m. before he sat down again. And he sat down with hope. The next day, Frank texted Kyle. Tell the others we're back in business. Bring donuts. The good kind. They showed up that afternoon with a 12-pack of glazed from a local bakery and an energy none of them even tried to hide. Maddie slapped a printout of her sketch on the table like blueprints. Leo had already printed a prototype bracket with his 3D printer. Kyle brought replacement screws and a few spare bolts. Frank watched them work with the same stubborn focus he used to see in the mirror at 30. You all came ready to go, he said. What did you think? Kyle grinned. We thought you'd quit. I almost did, Frank admitted. But then I remembered who I was. They got to work. By late afternoon, the cart was back on its wheels, stronger than ever. The new bracket held. The frame didn't creak. And when the motor kicked in, it glided forward without a hitch. Not perfect. But better. Maddie stood back, hands on her hips. That's beautiful. Frank chuckled. Looks like Frankenstein to me. Exactly, she said. Ugly and alive. They laughed. For the first time, Frank didn't just feel supported, he felt surrounded. Not by fans or followers. By partners. Students. Friends. That evening, Frank posted a new update online. Not a polished video. Just a photo of the repaired cart and a short message, we broke it. Then we built it back better. That's life, isn't it? Not about getting it right the first time. It's about showing up the next day anyway. I'm not done. Neither are you. The responses came in waves. One from a man who said he hadn't tried anything creative in 10 years, but now was reworking an old bicycle. One from a widow in Arizona who was replanting her late husband's garden, 1 square foot at a time. And another from a woman in Michigan, I just cried in my car reading this. I'm 66 and I've been afraid to start over. But if you can break something and still come back stronger, maybe I can too. Frank turned off the screen and sat in the dark. He thought about June. Thought about their hardest year, when the factory closed, and money was tight, and hope felt thin. She'd looked him in the eyes one night and said, you don't have to win every day. Just show up for it. He whispered the words aloud now, like a prayer. Just show up for it. The next week was full of steady work. Not easy. But full. They refined the cart. Added brakes. Improved the balance. Made it easier to load and unload. Every problem brought a new lesson. Every fix brought a little more confidence. More people started messaging Frank. Some asking for plans. Others just sharing stories. It wasn't just about carts anymore. It was about courage. Frank's courage. And the courage he gave others simply by not quitting. One morning, Kyle showed up holding his phone. You're not gonna believe this, he said. Elon Musk tweeted. Frank raised an eyebrow. About what? You. Frank blinked. Kyle handed over the phone. There it was. A screenshot of the cart and a quote from Frank's last post, shared from Elon's official account. We broke it. Then we built it back better. Respect. The future belongs to anyone still willing to build, no matter their age. Frank just stared. His heart beat like it used to when June would squeeze his hand before a big moment. Well, he said, slowly handing the phone back. That's one way to keep the week interesting. Kyle laughed. You're in the stratosphere now. But Frank didn't feel high or famous or important. He felt grounded. Purposeful. And more than anything, ready. Ready for the next rebuild. The next glitch. The next bolt that wouldn't turn. Because now he knew it wasn't about making something flawless. It was about making something that moved you forward, even after it broke. Especially after it broke. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Not an email. Not a text or comment or tag. A real letter. In an envelope. With a stamp. Frank hadn't received handwritten mail in a long time, at least, not anything that wasn't a holiday card or a coupon booklet pretending to be important. This one stood out. The handwriting was shaky but careful. His name spelled out in blue ink. No return address. Just a city and zip in the top left corner, Burlington, Vermont. He opened it slowly, carefully tearing the flap as he leaned against the kitchen counter. The paper inside was soft. 2 pages. Folded in thirds. At the top, Dear Mr. Frank Myers, he blinked. No one called him Mr. Myers anymore. It felt like something from another life, a name from when he wore pressed shirts and sat on safety committees. He kept reading. I don't know if this will reach you, but I saw your video on that electric cart you built. I'm 72. I used to be an engineer. I stopped calling myself that after my last job let me go. They said I was no longer aligned with the speed of innovation. That's code for, too slow, too old, too expensive. I believed them for years. Frank felt something tighten behind his ribs. He read on. Then I saw you in that dusty garage, pointing at a clunky motor and calling it beautiful. I saw your hands shake when you soldered, and I saw your eyes light up when the thing moved. And I thought, hell. That used to be me. I didn't cry at first. I just stared. Then I went out to my shed. I found my old workbench under a pile of tarps and grief. The next day, I started sketching something new. Not for a client. Not for a paycheck. Just because I could. Frank stopped reading for a moment. The room had grown very still. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the birds outside the kitchen window. He continued. I've started designing a water pump that runs off foot power. Nothing fancy. But my neighbor's on a walker and keeps talking about how hard it is to fill her garden hose. So I thought, maybe this could help. I used to believe I was finished. That the best I could do was stay out of the way. But your story flipped a switch in me. Reminded me I still matter. Still have tools in the drawer, as they say. At the bottom of the letter, the signature read, Thank you. For being brave enough to be seen. Walter S. Frank set the letter down, hands trembling slightly. He sat at the table, staring at the folded pages like they were sacred. And maybe, in a way, they were. Proof. Not just that his story had reached someone, but that someone else had reawakened because of it. He stood, walked to the garage, and sat down beside the cart. He ran a hand along the frame. It still had scratches and weld marks. Still carried the fingerprints of failure. But it also carried legacy now. One cart. One story. And now, one more builder back in motion. That afternoon, he showed the letter to Kyle. The kid read it in silence, then nodded. You ever gonna write him back? I don't have his address. No return listed. Kyle grinned. He's an engineer. He wants to be found. Give me 10 minutes. Frank chuckled, shaking his head, but sure enough, 15 minutes later, Kyle pulled up an address from a retirement community in Burlington. Frank wrote a reply that night. It took him 2 hours. He rewrote the first paragraph 3 times. Finally, he settled on something honest: Walter. I don't know how to say thank you in a way that matches what your letter did to me. But I'll try. You reminded me this wasn't a one-way story. You're not just watching, you're building. And that's the whole point. Keep going. We've got more in us than they think. Always did. Frank he mailed it the next morning. And for the rest of the week, he found himself checking the box a little more often. Not for new letters, but for that feeling. The quiet thrill of connection. Later that week, Kyle came by with more big news. So you know how Musk tweeted about you last week? Kinda hard to forget, Frank said. Well, now his foundation's team reached out. His foundation? Yeah. They're offering to donate parts, tools, maybe even help fund an online build guide, if you're interested. Frank just stared at him. You're serious? Dead serious. Frank ran a hand through his hair. All this, from one broken cart. Not broken anymore, Kyle said, slapping the handle. And maybe not just one cart soon. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. Not from nerves. From possibility. He got up around midnight, made a cup of tea, and stepped outside onto the porch. The stars were bright. A breeze stirred the wind chimes June had hung there 20 years ago. He sat in the old swing and rocked gently. For a long time, he just listened. Then, he whispered, almost too quiet to hear, "You were right, June." There was still more to do. The next morning, he brought out the notebook and started designing version 2. The senior builder's cart, simpler to assemble, easier to customize. He wanted it to be open source. Free to download. No gatekeeping. No price tags. Just something to get hands moving again. The next time someone whispered, "Maybe I can't anymore," he wanted them to have something to reach for. That week, he recorded a short video, his most direct one yet. Just him, standing beside the cart in his garage. I built this because I didn't know what else to do. I was lost. I thought maybe if I got my hands moving, my heart might follow. And it did. If you're watching this and thinking you're too old, too rusty, too forgotten, I've got news for you, you're not. You're just out of practice. Pick up the tool. Open the notebook. Start again. Even if it's shaky. Even if it breaks. Especially if it breaks. Because that's how you know you're building something real. He paused, then added, "And if you ever need proof you're not alone, write me a letter. I'll write back." He posted it. Went to bed. When he woke up the next day, he had over 500 new messages. But more than that, he had 4 new letters. Real ones. In the mailbox. Written by hand. From California, Georgia, New Mexico, and Maine. Each one a spark, carried by paper. Frank stood on the porch, holding them in both hands. Smiling. This wasn't a story about a man and a machine anymore. It was a story about people remembering who they were. Reclaiming what age had tried to take. Rewriting what done meant. And it all started with one decision: to build. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank's garage had quietly transformed into something he never imagined, a hub of quiet rebellion against fading away. It wasn't just the cart anymore. It was the gatherings that spilled into the backyard, the video calls that connected strangers who found themselves on the same uncertain path. He called them the Reclaimers, a loose-knit group of seniors who refused to accept that their best days were behind them. It started small. A few messages, a handful of letters, a couple of neighborhood visits. But the momentum grew like a slow sunrise. Every week, Frank hosted an online build night. It wasn't fancy. Just a Zoom call where anyone with a project, big or small, shared their progress, their struggles, their doubts. There was Clara, 68, who was handcrafting a wooden birdhouse for the first time since her husband died. There was Ed, 75, who was learning to code apps to help his grandkids with math. And then there was Maria, 62, who painted a mural in her local community center, something she never dared attempt when younger. Frank often marveled at their courage. "Why now?" he'd ask during calls. "Because you showed us it was okay to start again," they answered. "Because you made it look possible." It reminded Frank of Elon Musk's words he'd read years ago, about how failure was just a step on the road to success, how age was no barrier to invention. But this was more than invention. This was reinvention. One Saturday, a message popped up from Walter, the man in Vermont who had sent the letter. He had finished his foot-powered water pump. Video attached. It was clunky but functional. His neighbor, a woman named Joyce, was laughing as she used it to water her garden. "I haven't felt this alive in years," Walter said on the call. "Thank you for pushing me." That phrase echoed in Frank's mind. Push. That was the word. They were all pushing. Not just their projects, but the invisible weight of age, doubt, loneliness. One afternoon, Frank received a surprise invitation. A local community center wanted him to speak at a Senior Innovation Day. Not as a hobbyist, not as a curious retiree, but as a leader. As proof. Frank felt the familiar knot of nerves tighten. He wondered what June would say. Then he remembered her voice, calm and steady. "You don't have to be perfect. Just be real." On the day of the event, Frank stood at the front of a sunlit room filled with seniors. Some used canes. Some wore glasses thick as soda bottles. Some were quiet, others eager to talk. He shared his story, his fear, his failures, his breakthroughs. He talked about the cart, the letters, the community that had grown from scraps and sparks. He talked about Elon Musk's radical belief that boundaries were meant to be pushed. And as he spoke, the room transformed. He saw eyes brighten, shoulders straighten, hands fidget with pens and notebooks. Afterward, a woman approached him. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "I used to be a graphic designer. Now, I'm starting a podcast for seniors like us, to share stories of second chances. Would you be interested?" Frank smiled, feeling the old thrill of possibility. "Count me in." Over the next few months, the Reclaimers became more than an online group. They met in parks, libraries, community centers. They swapped tools, shared skills, celebrated each little success. It wasn't always easy. Some days were full of doubt, aches, setbacks. But they learned to remind each other, progress is a zigzag. Not a straight line. One evening, Frank watched a new video from Maddie. She was working on a prototype of an eco-friendly scooter for seniors with mobility issues. The design was raw, but the enthusiasm in her voice was undeniable. "We're just getting started," she said, smiling. Frank nodded, thinking about the journey they'd all been on, him, Maddie, Kyle, and the growing tribe of Reclaimers around the world. They were proof that the story of aging didn't have to be about fading out. It could be about fighting forward. About reclaiming space in a world that often told them to step aside. And for Frank, that was the most powerful invention of all. Not everything was smooth sailing. Even as the community of Reclaimers grew, Frank faced moments that cut through the optimism like cold winds. One afternoon, a call came in from his doctor. The kind of call that silences a room. "Frank, your test results are back, Dr. Larson said gently. "Your blood pressure is high. Your heart rhythm isn't what we'd like. You need to slow down." The words hit Frank harder than any mechanical failure. "Slow down," he repeated, voice thick. "Doc, I'm building something here. I'm finally moving." "I know," Dr. Larson replied. "But your body isn't the same as it was 10 years ago. We need to be realistic." Frank hung up, his hands clenched on the phone. It was the moment he feared, the battle between the fire in his soul and the fragile container of flesh holding it. He sat down in the garage, surrounded by half-finished parts, glowing softly under the work lamp. He thought about June, about the years they'd promised each other to keep going, no matter what. But now, that promise felt like a fragile thread. The next morning, he called Kyle and confessed the news. "I don't know if I can keep pushing," he said. "My body's warning me to quit." Kyle didn't hesitate. "Frank, you're the strongest person I know. But strength isn't just muscle or willpower. It's also knowing when to listen. We can adjust. We can find ways to make this work without breaking you." Frank felt a flicker of relief. Maybe it wasn't about giving up. Maybe it was about adapting. That afternoon, Frank shared his struggles in the weekly call. Voices came flooding in. Clara, who had fought arthritis for years. Ed, managing his diabetes. Maria, balancing caregiving and creativity. "You're not alone," Clara said softly. "We all have limits. But we don't have to be defined by them." Frank realized that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was part of the journey. Inspired, he worked with Kyle to redesign the cart to be lighter, more ergonomic. They added handles for easier grip, swapped heavy parts for aluminum, and included brakes that required less force. They even explored adding a small electric assist, blending old-school grit with new technology. The redesign took months, but when the new cart rolled out, it was like a rebirth. Frank felt the difference immediately: less strain, more control. And more than that, a renewed sense of balance between passion and self-care. Meanwhile, the Reclaimers community began discussing health openly, sharing tips on staying active without burning out. They invited experts for talks on nutrition, mental wellness, and safe exercise. Frank learned that resilience wasn't about ignoring pain, it was about working with it. One evening, while scrolling through his messages, Frank saw a note from a woman named Gloria. She wrote, "I'm 70, and after a stroke, I lost my confidence to create. But watching your journey showed me I could start again, on my own terms. I'm working on painting again, even if it's just one brushstroke a day." Frank felt tears prick his eyes. That single message summed up everything he'd learned: progress isn't always loud or fast. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and deeply personal. He recorded a new video for the group: "I want to talk about something important, listening to your body. I know it's tempting to push through the pain, to prove something. But strength is also knowing when to pause. When to adapt. When to let your passion fuel you and protect you. We're not invincible. We're human. And that's okay. We keep building, not by racing, but by pacing ourselves." The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from seniors thanking him for this new honesty. For modeling vulnerability as a form of courage. Frank realized that this was growth, not just in his projects, but in himself. Elon Musk's fearless mindset had pushed him to dream big, to break barriers. But now, Frank was learning a new kind of bravery, the bravery to accept limits, to recalibrate, to keep moving without burning out. He thought about June again. About how she balanced strength with gentleness. How she reminded him that love wasn't about force, but about care. On a quiet evening, Frank sat on the porch with his notebook. He scribbled down a quote he found from Elon. "Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. Frank smiled. He wasn't giving up. He was choosing how to persist. The path wasn't always a straight line. Sometimes it was a bend, a pause, a detour. And that was part of the story worth telling. Because every single person over 60, facing doubt or physical hurdles, could rewrite their own map. They just had to believe it was possible. And keep showing up. Frank learned quickly that transformation wasn't about giant leaps but tiny steps. The cart project had become more than a machine, it was a mirror reflecting every small victory along the way. Every adjustment, every sketch, every email from someone who said, "I'm trying too," was a thread in a growing tapestry of hope. One morning, as Frank adjusted the brakes on the new cart, Kyle burst through the garage door, a stack of papers in hand. "Look at this," he said breathless. "A local school wants to partner with us. They're starting a program where seniors teach kids about engineering basics." Frank blinked. "You mean, like a mentorship?" "Exactly. Seniors sharing their skills, stories, and maybe some life lessons." The idea struck Frank like a bolt. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about reclaiming purpose for seniors, it was about passing that fire forward. The first workshop was set for a crisp Saturday morning in the local community center's gym. Frank wasn't sure what to expect. Would the kids show up? Would the seniors feel comfortable? When the day arrived, Frank's nerves buzzed like static electricity. The room was a mix of folding chairs, scattered tools, and an array of curious faces, some lined with wrinkles, some still bright with childhood wonder. The kids came with wide eyes and questions. "What's this? How does it work? Can I build one?" The seniors, many of whom had never worked directly with children before, found themselves telling stories, explaining basics, and watching amazement light up young faces. Frank noticed Clara, who had once said she was too old to teach, gently guiding a boy through wiring a simple circuit. Ed was showing a group how to measure angles on a piece of scrap wood. Maria was painting signs for the workshop, her laughter filling the room. The session wasn't perfect. Wires got tangled. Screws dropped. Patience wore thin. But beneath the chaos was something unmistakable: connection. At the end, the kids clapped and asked when they could come back. One little girl tugged Frank's sleeve and said, "I want to build robots when I grow up." Frank smiled, heart full. "You can do anything you set your mind to," he told her. Afterward, the seniors gathered outside, tired but glowing. "I never thought I'd feel this useful again," Clara said softly. "Me neither," said Ed, "it's like we found new roles." Frank realized this was the kind of legacy June had always hoped for, not fame or fortune, but meaning. This new chapter wasn't about proving something to the world. It was about sharing wisdom, passing the torch, and building bridges between generations. Elon Musk's example had pushed Frank to think beyond limits, but this was a lesson in humility and grace, that sometimes the most radical act is simply to show up and share what you know. As weeks turned into months, the mentorship program grew. Schools in neighboring towns joined in. Videos of workshops were shared online, inspiring others. Frank started receiving messages from seniors around the country, sharing their own stories of teaching, learning, and connecting. It wasn't always easy to start. Fear whispered, "You're too old. They won't listen." But every small victory, the smile from a child, the grateful nod from a fellow senior, was proof that the voices of experience mattered deeply. One evening, Frank sat on his porch, notebook on his lap, reflecting on the journey. He wrote, "Small victories are the stitches that hold the fabric of change together." The moment he learned to accept limitations and pace himself had been one of those stitches. The first letter from Walter had been another. The mentorship program, yet another. Each one felt like a heartbeat in the larger story. Frank knew the path ahead would still have challenges. There would be doubts, health scares, days when the weight of years felt unbearable. But he also knew something else: that purpose didn't have an expiration date. It simply shifted shape. And sometimes, the smallest steps forward were the most powerful of all. Frank had come a long way since that first tentative moment in his garage. The cart, the community, the workshops, each step a testament to perseverance. But deep down, a new challenge was stirring, learning to live with uncertainty. It wasn't the mechanical kind of uncertainty he could fix with tools or plans. It was the big, looming kind, questions about the future, about health, about whether his dreams could last. One evening, after a long day of adjustments and calls, Frank sat by the window watching the fading light over the neighborhood. The sky was a smoky swirl of oranges and purples, a reminder that days passed quickly. His hands felt stiff, the ache of his heart's warning still fresh. The question echoed in his mind, how much longer do I have? That question, heavy and silent, made the room feel smaller. For years, Frank had feared this moment, the realization that time was not infinite. But the truth was, uncertainty wasn't something he could avoid. It was something he had to accept. The next morning, he reached for an old book on his shelf, Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, and the quest for a fantastic future. As he flipped the pages, one quote leapt out. "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Those words resonated deeply. Frank realized he had been clinging to certainty like a lifeline, when true courage was about stepping forward without guarantees. He shared his thoughts on the weekly call. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Scared of what might happen. Of losing progress. Of failing again." The group responded with empathy. "Fear is natural," said Clara. "But it doesn't have to stop us. We face uncertainty every day," added Maria. "But we choose to act anyway." Inspired, Frank decided to embrace uncertainty as part of his journey rather than an enemy. He set new goals, not grand, unreachable feats, but manageable steps fueled by passion, not fear. One day, a surprise came in the form of an email from a local news station interested in his story. They wanted to film a segment about seniors redefining aging. Frank hesitated. The thought of cameras, public attention, vulnerability, it was daunting. But then he remembered Elon's mindset, to risk, to disrupt, to defy. With a steady breath, Frank agreed. The filming process was both exhilarating and exhausting. The crew came into his garage, capturing the sound of tools, the focused expression on his face, the smiles exchanged with Kyle and the reclaimers. When the segment aired, it sparked a wave of responses, emails, calls, social media messages from seniors inspired to start their own projects. Some thanked him for showing that it's never too late. Others shared stories of their own fears and hopes. Frank felt the weight of their words. His story was no longer just his own, it was a beacon. Yet the attention brought new challenges. Not everyone understood or supported the message. Some critics dismissed it as a feel-good story that ignored the harsh realities of aging. Others warned Frank not to overextend himself. But Frank held on to the balance he'd found, pushing forward with care, embracing support, acknowledging limits without surrendering dreams. One afternoon, he received a call from June. "I watched the segment," she said softly. "You're lighting a fire, Frank. Just remember, it's okay to rest when you need it." Her voice grounded him. He realized that embracing uncertainty also meant accepting help, kindness, and rest as part of the process. In the months that followed, Frank found new rhythms, balancing work with downtime, passion with patience. The CART project evolved. The mentorship program expanded. And Frank, once haunted by fear, grew into a quiet confidence rooted in acceptance. He no longer chased certainty but danced with the unknown. As summer faded into fall, Frank stood in his garage, the smell of sawdust mingling with the crisp air. He looked at the cart, the plans, the messages from the reclaimers. He thought about Elon's words, the community's support, and June's steady love. And he smiled, knowing that the true journey wasn't about reaching a final destination. It was about moving forward, uncertain, imperfect, but unstoppable. Frank had always thought of himself as a man defined by his work, his role as a provider, and the dreams he'd tucked away long ago. But the journey of reinvention was forcing him to confront a profound question: who was he now? The years had layered on more than wrinkles and aches, they had changed how he saw himself. After the viral news segment, Frank found himself navigating not only the external changes but the internal ones. Old labels, retired, slow, too old, clung to him like shadows. One morning, sitting with a cup of coffee that tasted more bitter than he remembered, Frank stared at his reflection in the kitchen window. The man looking back was familiar but also strange. The years behind his eyes held stories no one saw. "Who am I now?" he whispered to the empty room. The question was heavy but necessary. Slowly, Frank began to explore. He journaled about his fears and hopes. He talked openly with June, who reminded him that identity wasn't fixed, it was a living thing, shaped by choices and moments. He reached out to old friends, some of whom had drifted away, and found surprises, shared regrets, new hopes, common ground. The Reclaimers community became a lifeline, a place where people were more than their age. They were artists, teachers, builders, learners. One evening, during a virtual meetup, Frank shared his struggle. "I feel like I'm trying to shed an old skin but I don't know what's underneath." Clara responded gently, "Maybe the question isn't who you were or who you are now, but who you want to become." That idea sparked something in Frank. Identity wasn't about a fixed point but a journey forward. He began experimenting, not just with the cart or teaching kids, but with parts of himself he'd ignored. He started writing essays about aging, resilience, and purpose, posting them on a blog that soon gathered a modest but devoted following. Writing opened new doors. Readers wrote back, sharing their own stories and struggles. For many, Frank's honesty was a lifeline. Meanwhile, the physical challenges remained. But instead of fighting to be the man he once was, Frank focused on being the man he could be today. He took up yoga for seniors, learned meditation, and found new joy in slow walks through the neighborhood park. Each day was a step toward a fuller self. At the annual Senior Innovation Day, Frank delivered a talk titled "Redefining Who We Are." He spoke not only about his projects but about the deep inner work of acceptance and growth. The audience was captivated, many wiping tears as he shared the raw truths of vulnerability and hope. Elon Musk's influence lingered throughout Frank's journey, the fearless spirit to challenge limits and the willingness to embrace failure. But Frank had added something new: grace with imperfection, patience with self, and courage to be authentic. One afternoon, June surprised him with a small gift, a framed photo of Frank standing beside the cart, surrounded by smiling kids and seniors. "This is who you are now," she said. "Not just the man who builds, but the man who inspires." Frank realized that identity wasn't a destination but a mosaic, a blend of past, present, and future shaped by every choice, every story told, every connection made. He was no longer bound by old definitions. He was a living, evolving testament to the power of reinvention at any age. And in that truth, he found a new kind of freedom. Frank's journey had brought him through doubts, reinvention, and connection, but he was beginning to sense a deeper calling, one that went beyond his own dreams or challenges. It was about service, about contributing something meaningful to the world that outlasted him. One chilly morning, Frank received a letter from the local Veterans Center. They were organizing a program to help seniors volunteer their skills to improve the lives of other older adults struggling with mobility and isolation. They wondered if Frank would be interested in participating. The idea resonated immediately. For years, Frank had focused on reclaiming his own purpose, but now the possibility of helping others rekindled a new fire. At the first meeting, Frank listened to stories that mirrored his own, stories of loss, loneliness, and yearning to matter. The veterans spoke of their service long ago, but now they sought ways to serve again, in different forms. Frank offered to help design simple mobility aids and organize workshops to teach other seniors about using technology for independence. The group welcomed him warmly. Working alongside people who had faced battles both visible and invisible, Frank felt a profound kinship. Each person brought unique strengths and wisdom. One afternoon, Frank met Ruth, a retired nurse who had started a program to deliver meals to homebound seniors. She shared her struggles with funding and outreach. Frank offered to help build a website and use social media to spread the word. Together, they launched a campaign that grew beyond their town, inspiring similar programs in neighboring communities. The act of serving others gave Frank a new sense of purpose, a reminder that no matter the years behind you, the ability to make a difference remains. Inspired by Elon Musk's relentless drive to solve problems bigger than himself, Frank saw service as the ultimate innovation, a way to combine heart, mind, and community for lasting impact. In the evenings, Frank reflected on the changes he'd experienced. His fears about aging hadn't disappeared, but they no longer ruled him. Instead, they became part of a larger story, one where age was not a barrier but a bridge. He began writing an essay titled "The Power of Purpose After 60, which quickly became one of his most read posts. In it, he wrote, "Purpose is not reserved for the young. It's the spark that fuels every day, the reason to keep building, loving, and dreaming." One day, as Frank worked on a mobility aid prototype, a young volunteer named Jenna approached him. "You've changed the way I see aging," she said. "You're proof that life after 60 can be vibrant and full of possibility." Frank smiled, touched by her words. "We all have something to offer," he replied. "Sometimes it just takes a little spark to light the way." That spark had started with a moment of crisis, a question of worth, and a challenge to believe in something greater. It was a lesson Frank carried in every step he took. The service work wasn't without struggles. Funding was tight. Bureaucracy slowed progress. Frank faced days when his body protested and doubts crept in. But the community he'd built, the reclaimers, the veterans, the volunteers, held each other up. Together, they embodied the truth Elon Musk had shown through his life: bold vision requires resilience, collaboration, and an unshakable belief in possibility. On a crisp autumn day, Frank stood before a gathering of seniors and community members to speak about the power of purpose. His voice steady and clear, he shared stories of transformation, service, and hope. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, not just for him, but for the movement he represented. That night, sitting beside June under a blanket of stars, Frank whispered, "I never imagined my life could hold so much meaning this late. But here we are." June squeezed his hand. "You were never too old, Frank. You just needed to see it. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning." And Frank was ready. Frank's journey toward purpose and connection brought unexpected clarity but also resurfaced old wounds he had tried to bury. Forgiveness, he realized, was a challenge as important as any he had faced. Years earlier, before the CART project or the community workshops, Frank had fallen out with his son, David. Their relationship had fractured over misunderstandings, pride, and unspoken regrets. The silence between them was a constant ache. Despite Frank's efforts to rebuild bridges, David had kept his distance, unwilling or unable to forgive. The success of Frank's recent project stirred a longing in him for reconciliation, but the fear of rejection lingered. One afternoon, after a reclaimers meeting, Frank sat alone, scrolling through his phone, hesitating to call David. He thought of Elon Musk's approach: bold, fearless, willing to face failure and criticism head-on. If Elon could risk everything to change industries and face the world's skepticism, could Frank muster the courage to reach out? He drafted a message: "David, I miss you. Can we talk?" His thumb hovered over "send" for what felt like hours before he finally tapped. Days passed without a reply, the silence thick and suffocating. Frank wrestled with doubt and hope. Was it too late? Did David even want to reconnect? He shared his struggle with Clara during a call. "Forgiveness is hard," she said. "But it starts with vulnerability. Sometimes, just opening the door is the bravest act." Frank decided to write a letter, pouring out years of regret, love, and hope. He sent it by mail, unsure if it would ever be read. Weeks later, a response came, not from David, but from his daughter, Emma. She wrote that David had been touched by the letter but needed time. She hoped they could all find a way forward. The small opening gave Frank cautious hope. Over the next months, there were more letters, phone calls, tentative visits. The wounds were deep, and progress was slow. But each step forward was a victory. Frank learned that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past but about embracing imperfection, allowing space for healing. One afternoon, David came to the workshop. The moment was awkward but charged with emotion. They talked honestly, about pain, mistakes, and love that had never faded. Tears came freely, breaking years of silence. Frank realized forgiveness was not just a gift for others but a balm for his own soul. It allowed him to move forward unburdened by resentment. The experience inspired Frank to write another blog post, titled "The Power of Forgiveness After 60." He shared his story with raw honesty, inviting others to confront their own unresolved relationships. The response was overwhelming. Seniors across the country reached out, sharing stories of estrangement and longing. Some found the courage to reach out, others offered support and understanding. Forgiveness became a new kind of service, a way to rebuild not just projects but hearts. Frank's reconciliation with David didn't erase the past but opened a path to new memories, new understanding. It was a reminder that no matter the years, healing was possible. The journey wasn't linear or easy, but it was worth every step. In the quiet moments after David left that day, Frank looked at the setting sun and felt a profound sense of peace. Forgiveness, he realized, was a form of courage that transcended age. It was a choice to embrace vulnerability, to risk pain for the chance of love. Inspired by Elon Musk's fearless pursuit of the impossible, Frank found his own bravery, not in innovation or invention, but in opening his heart. And that courage, he knew, was the most powerful change of all. Frank's personal growth was undeniable, but the most profound transformation came when he fully embraced the power of community. Throughout his journey, the threads of connection, his neighbors, the reclaimers, June, Clara, even the hesitant calls with David, had woven a fabric of belonging that became a source of strength. One crisp morning, Frank stood outside the community center, watching a group of seniors gather for their weekly innovation workshop. The air was filled with laughter, the hum of conversation, and the rhythmic tapping of tools and keyboards. It was a far cry from the isolation he'd once felt. That sense of belonging was a revelation. Frank remembered the early days, when he worked alone in his garage, uncertain if anyone cared. Now, the energy was electric. People shared ideas, helped each other with problems, celebrated small wins, and offered support during setbacks. The diversity of experience and backgrounds was staggering. There was Ruth, who had pioneered meal delivery programs, Clara, who organized virtual support groups, Kyle, who designed mobility devices, and many others who brought unique talents. This mosaic of skills and stories was more than a community, it was a movement. Frank recalled a quote from Elon Musk, "If something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." The odds had once seemed stacked against seniors like them, dismissed, overlooked, written off. But together, they defied expectations. One afternoon, Frank helped organize a senior innovation fair to showcase projects, from gardening initiatives to digital literacy programs. The event drew attention from local media, city officials, and younger generations curious about the passion and ingenuity on display. Watching the fair unfold, Frank felt a swell of pride. This wasn't just about individual achievement, it was about collective empowerment. The fair became an annual tradition, growing bigger each year. Frank saw firsthand how community created momentum, transforming lives one connection at a time. The reclaimers also formed mentorship partnerships, pairing seniors with local students to share knowledge and break down age barriers. Frank loved working with a high school student named Jasmine, whose curiosity and energy reignited his own. They learned from each other. He taught her woodworking and resilience, she taught him about social media and new technology. Their bond symbolized the bridge between generations. Frank's own family, once distant, began to participate more actively in community events, bridging old divides. The healing power of shared purpose rippled outward. But the journey wasn't without challenges. Conflict occasionally arose, differences in opinions, frustrations with pace or priorities. Frank learned that community required patience, humility, and communication. He drew on lessons from Elon Musk's leadership, sometimes visionary, sometimes contentious, but ultimately driven by a desire to innovate and improve. Frank encouraged open dialogue, reminding the group that their shared goal transcended disagreements. One evening, during a particularly heated discussion about funding allocation, Frank spoke calmly, "Our strength isn't just in our ideas but in our ability to listen and support each other. That's what will carry us forward." The group softened, finding common ground. Over time, the community grew not just in numbers but in spirit. Neighbors who once passed each other with nods now exchanged stories, meals, and support. The sense of isolation that haunted many seniors began to fade. Frank understood that aging was no longer a solitary journey but a shared adventure. Inspired by this, he wrote an essay titled, "Together, We Rise," emphasizing that community was the key to transforming the narrative of aging from decline to possibility. His words resonated widely, inspiring other communities to form their own reclaimer groups. One afternoon, Frank received a call from a young entrepreneur who wanted to collaborate on a project to connect seniors with technology mentors nationwide. The idea was bold, ambitious, and perfectly aligned with everything Frank believed. The future, he realized, wasn't just about individual innovation, it was about building networks of support that spanned generations and geographies. Standing on the porch of his home, watching a group of reclaimers paint a mural celebrating their journey, Frank felt a profound gratitude. The fire that Elon Musk had ignited inside him had grown into a blaze of collective hope. He was no longer just a man rebuilding his life. He was part of a vibrant, unstoppable community rewriting what it meant to grow older. The journey had taught him that purpose, healing, and joy were found not in isolation, but in connection. And in that truth, Frank finally understood, no one is ever too old to belong, to lead, or to change the world. For much of his life, Frank had seen technology as a bewildering force, a fast-moving tide that left him feeling out of step and invisible. The glow of screens often seemed like a barrier, a sign that the world was moving on without him. But as his journey progressed, Frank realized that technology could be a bridge instead of a wall. One evening, after a long day organizing community projects, Frank sat at his kitchen table staring at his laptop. The screen blinked with messages from readers of his blog, video calls from the reclaimers, and invitations to virtual workshops. It was overwhelming, but also exhilarating. Frank remembered a quote he'd heard from Elon Musk during a podcast, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Frank decided it was time to stop fearing technology and start embracing it. With the help of Clara and a patient volunteer named Jasmine, he began learning the basics: email, social media, video conferencing. The first few weeks were frustrating. Mistakes were frequent, screens froze, links got lost, and jargon felt like a foreign language. But each small victory, a successful video call, a blog post published, fueled his confidence. Frank discovered that technology wasn't just a tool, it was a portal to connection, learning, and influence. Through social media, his blog posts reached people across the country and beyond, sparking conversations about aging, resilience, and purpose. He joined online forums for seniors passionate about innovation, sharing ideas and encouragement. He started hosting virtual workshops, teaching fellow reclaimers how to use smartphones and tablets to stay connected. One day, Frank helped Ruth set up a website for her meal delivery program. Watching the website go live felt like a triumph, proof that technology could amplify their efforts and impact more lives. Frank's relationship with technology transformed from fear to empowerment. He realized it was never too late to learn, to adapt, to change. This realization spilled into other areas of his life, deepening his commitment to growth. The local library invited him to lead a series of Tech for Seniors classes, where he combined patience with humor to break down barriers. His approach was less about mastery and more about curiosity and courage, values Elon Musk exemplified. At one session, a skeptical attendee named Harold confessed, "I thought I was too old for this stuff, but you make it seem possible." Frank smiled and replied, "We're all learners, no matter our age. The only limit is the one we believe." As Frank's confidence grew, so did his impact. Local newspapers and radio stations took notice, featuring his story as an example of senior innovation. Younger generations were inspired by his enthusiasm and openness. Frank often thought about the contrast between the loneliness he'd felt in the past and the vibrant network he'd built through technology and community. On a brisk spring afternoon, Frank received an invitation to speak at a regional conference on aging and innovation. Standing before an audience of policymakers, caregivers, and seniors, he shared his story, one of fear, struggle, reinvention, and ultimately, empowerment through technology. His message was clear: age is not a barrier to learning or contribution. Frank's speech was met with standing ovations and heartfelt conversations. He realized that his journey was bigger than himself, it was part of a larger movement to redefine aging in the digital age. That night, as he sat beside June watching the city lights twinkle, Frank felt a quiet pride. The man who once felt invisible in a fast-moving world was now a beacon for others seeking connection and purpose. Technology had opened doors he never imagined, proving that the future was still his to shape. And in that truth, Frank found peace, passion, and limitless possibility. Frank sat in his favorite armchair, gazing out at the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The journey he had taken, from isolation and doubt to purpose and connection, felt surreal. But one question still echoed in his mind: what did success really mean at this stage of life? For decades, success had been defined by careers, financial gains, and milestones measured in youth's terms. Now, those metrics seemed irrelevant or out of reach. Yet, inspired by Elon Musk's defiant approach to failure and reinvention, Frank knew success was something he could redefine. Success wasn't about wealth or accolades. It was about impact, resilience, and meaning. It was waking up with a sense of purpose and going to bed knowing you'd made a difference. Frank thought about the small victories, the smiles he'd inspired, the friendships forged, the lives touched by the reclaimer's work. Those were his true successes. One afternoon, Frank received a call from an old friend, Mike, who had achieved business fame but now faced his own crisis of purpose in retirement. Mike confessed his envy of Frank's vitality and asked how he'd found meaning in his later years. Frank answered honestly, "I stopped chasing what I thought success was and started looking for what mattered to me." It's never too late to rewrite your story. This conversation sparked Frank to write an essay titled "Redefining Success After 60, which quickly gained traction online. He shared stories of seniors who had started new careers, embraced hobbies, mended relationships, and pioneered community change. Each example underscored a simple truth: success is personal and evolving. One of Frank's most poignant moments came when he was invited to a local school to talk about aging and dreams. Standing before teenagers, he shared his journey, failures, and the courage to keep going. He challenged them to rethink what success meant in their own lives, emphasizing resilience and empathy over accolades. Watching their curious faces, Frank felt hope. The future wasn't just theirs, it belonged to all who dared to redefine themselves at any age. In his own community, Frank saw this redefinition unfolding daily. Ruth's meal program expanded into a regional network. Clara's virtual groups blossomed into statewide initiatives. And the reclaimers continued to innovate, breaking stereotypes and barriers. Frank often reflected on Elon Musk's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Those words had propelled him through fear, failure, and doubt. They reminded him that success was less about the destination and more about the relentless pursuit of what mattered. One evening, as Frank and June prepared dinner, he shared his thoughts. "I used to think success was something I had to prove. Now I know it's something I live every day, in kindness, courage, and connection." June smiled. "You've already succeeded, Frank. In ways that truly matter." The journey wasn't over, but Frank embraced the uncertainty with grace. He had learned that success was not a trophy to earn but a life to be lived fully and authentically. In this new understanding, Frank found peace and strength to face whatever came next. And as the stars emerged in the twilight sky, he whispered a quiet thank you to the spark that had started it all, Elon Musk's fearless message to never give up, never stop dreaming, no matter the age. In that message, Frank had found not just inspiration, but a lifelong invitation to redefine what it meant to thrive. Frank stood in his garden, the soft hum of evening cicadas filling the air as the last rays of sunlight kissed the leaves of the apple trees he had planted years ago. He breathed deeply, savoring the scent of earth and blossoms, a quiet contrast to the chaos of his earlier life. This garden was more than a patch of land, it was a symbol, a living testament to growth, resilience, and the legacy he was finally crafting. As he looked back over the years, Frank marveled at the transformation. The man who once felt forgotten, invisible, and too old to change had become a beacon of hope for seniors everywhere. His story had rippled far beyond his small town, inspiring others to rise, reconnect, and redefine their lives. The journey had not been easy. There were moments of despair, rejection, and doubt. The strained relationship with his son, the early failures, the fear of embracing technology, all those battles had seemed insurmountable. Yet, through it all, one truth remained: it was never too late to begin again. Frank remembered the pivotal moment that shifted everything, the day he first heard Elon Musk speak about pushing limits, embracing failure, and daring to dream regardless of obstacles. Elon's words had ignited a fire that would carry Frank through his darkest hours. They had challenged the idea that aging meant retreat and resignation. Instead, Frank learned that aging could be a powerful phase of reinvention, purpose, and connection. Over the years, Frank's efforts had blossomed into a movement. The Reclaimers grew into a thriving community, a network of seniors supporting each other in innovation, healing, and advocacy. Their stories reached national media, inspiring policymakers to rethink how society values and engages its older citizens. Frank's blog had become a platform for voices too often unheard. He had mentored dozens, collaborated on technology projects, and helped heal fractured families. Each act, big or small, was a thread woven into the rich tapestry of his new legacy. One afternoon, Frank sat with June, reflecting on the journey. "I thought this chapter of my life would be about slowing down," he said. "Instead, it's been about stepping up. Showing up for myself and others in ways I never imagined." June reached for his hand, her eyes shining with pride. "You weren't too old. You were just waiting to believe you mattered again." Frank smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle in his bones. He thought of Elon Musk one last time, the man who symbolized fearless innovation and relentless determination. Elon had sparked the fire, but Frank had carried it forward with grit, heart, and community. Frank understood now that legacy wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about impact, how many lives you touch, how much hope you give, how deeply you choose to live. As twilight deepened, Frank rose and walked to a bench beneath the apple trees. He pulled out a small notebook and began to write, reflections, hopes, lessons learned. This was his gift to the future, a roadmap for anyone who might feel lost or left behind. "You're never too old," he wrote, "to reclaim your story, to build new dreams, to find purpose. Age is a door, not a wall. Step through it with courage, and you'll discover a world waiting for you. The garden around him seemed to pulse with life, a living metaphor for growth that never stops. Frank knew his time was finite, but the legacy he had created would endure. Nurtured by the community he helped build, the relationships he healed, and the courage he inspired. In the end, Frank was not just a man who changed his own life, he was a symbol of what it means to live fully, boldly, and without apology at any age. His story was a beacon for every senior who had ever doubted their worth, reminding them that the future belongs to those who dare to dream, act, and believe. As the stars emerged overhead, Frank closed his notebook, heart full. The journey had been his greatest adventure. And in that adventure, he had found the true meaning of legacy, not what you leave behind, but how you live today. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?